What is this? No. Tell them I want it shaken, not stirred. Hello, I'm Anderson. Mr. Anderson. And today we're going to be talking about the Cold War, specifically espionage during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and how that shaped a great deal of what we come to think about in this climactic war between America and the USSR. I'm also going to be discussing with you today the closest moment we ever came as a human race to obliteration. It's called the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it happened in October 1962. Along with that, the Bay of Pigs invasion. We'll last check out what it was like to live during Cold War America. You'll find that our world is shaped still today by events and culture that lived in fear of being destroyed by a nuclear attack. All this and more in the next 30 minutes. The year is 1960, and you, an American, hear on the radio, on the TV, that one of our planes has been lost. Not just crashed, but it has been lost behind enemy territory. It was called the U-2. It was a spy plane nicknamed Dragon Lady, and it was the best at what it could do, which was to take pictures at a colossal height of over 70,000 feet high. This spy plane, state-of-the-art, could fly over Soviet territory and take pictures of the Soviet Union, something we had never had the chance to do before. At the helm was our most experienced pilot, a man named Francis Gary Powers, over 27 different mission flights that he had experience about. But on this one specific day in 1960, May 1st, what we call May Day, the report is the Soviet Union shot down this spy plane. Now, of course, all of this was confidential. We could not take responsibility that we had actually been flying spy planes over Soviet territory. So America just said we had lost a spy plane and the pilot must have gone unconscious behind the wheel. But shortly thereafter, the man who took over the Soviet Union's control after Joseph Stalin had died, a little short, stubby, bald, fat little man named Nikita Khrushchev, he shocked the Western world by saying, not only, America, were you spying on us, but we have pieces of the spy plane right here, and we have the pilot still alive right here. Francis Gary Powers had been interrogated and tortured. When you're a pilot for a top secret spy mission, you're given a pill, and you take that pill. It's called cyanide, and it's an instant death means to make sure that the secrets you have don't get shared with your enemy. But Powers did not take this tablet, this pill. In fact, he was under orders to tell his captors whatever he knew, because it was believed that pilots did not understand much of the bigger plans of their superior officers. So he was questioned by the Soviet Union, and eventually he was sentenced to 3 years in prison behind Soviet walls, but he was eventually traded out with another spy that we had caught from the Soviet Union, and he eventually was returned to the United States. This obviously made America look bad, and our president at the time, President Dwight Eisenhower, nicknamed Ike, he took full responsibility for this failure to hide our stealth missions. This wasn't the only espionage spy fail. Just 8 years before, the Soviet Union had been found to have been spying on the American embassy, our little American building inside of Moscow, where we were supposed to have peaceful diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Our ambassador at the time, a man named George Kennan, a well-respected diplomat and historian, It was found in his office. The Soviet Union had given him a huge wooden seal, the Great Seal of the United States of America, in his office as a gift. But hidden inside of this big seal was actually a pencil-shaped microphone amplifier that could pick up every word that he was saying. And spies from the Soviet Union were listening in to every word that the American ambassador was saying inside of the quiet of his own office, not knowing that every bit of American business was being picked up and listened to by the Soviet Union. And when we found that microphone, that sound recording device, we also got really angry with the Soviet Union, just as they did 8 years later with the finding of the U-2 crashed spy plane and Francis Gary Powers. For understandable reasons, spies became very big during the Cold War. Maybe you recognize this guy. It's been since the 1950s since Ian Fleming has written his James Bond novels, and since the 1960s when they made movies about him, and they're still making James Bond movies to this day. It's been over 50 years. There's so many spy stories that I could be sharing with you, but the one biggest one we're going to share right now is this. It's called the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it takes place, ta-da, in the waters off of and on the shores of Cuba. All right, so some background information at first. Cuba has long since been an island ruled by European countries. Spain controlled Cuba, the island, for hundreds of years as a slave colony, eventually being kicked off of the island during the Spanish-American War, where America fought Spain, and we momentarily took control of Cuba. After that, Cuba became very friendly with and adopted and hosted many American businesses there on its shores. In fact, America took advantage of a lot of Cuban economy in the next several decades. By 1959, this is a year before Francis Gary Powers was shot down out of the sky, Cuba was ruled by a man named Fulgencio Batista. Now, you don't have to remember his name, but this is what he looked like. True, he was friendly with Americans and American businesses, but he devastated the Cuban people. He took away the rights of the people at every opportunity in order to enrich himself. And so it was not a surprise that in 1959, one young leader wanted to throw off Fulgencio Batista and to set up something better in Cuba. This young leader got permission from America to be able to stage a revolution and to throw out this dictator, Batista, from the Cuban government. Many people flocked to this young leader's cause. He was Cuban, he was charismatic. When Batista canceled all free elections, this young leader wanted to put a stop to this gross injustice, and America agreed to back him up. This young leader's name in Cuba was Fidel Castro. So, on the 26th of July, 26 de Julio, 1959, this young guy with this recognizable beard and hat, Fidel Castro, led the revolution in Cuba, and he succeeded in taking power away from Batista and to set up a new government in Cuba. America was all, yeah, this is great news. So dictatorship is gone. Now Fidel Castro could put in new democratic reform in the country of Cuba. This seems like good news for America. Wrong. Fidel Castro, as soon as he was in power, set himself up as the new dictator. And he, along with his favorite aides, including Che Guevara, who was instrumental in setting up revolutions and making sure the government had total control. Che was a fanatic supporter of communism and was put in charge of allying with the Soviet Union instead of America, and in charge of public executions and appeals. He was committed to take down governments and set up new ones under totalitarian control. Castro took control quickly. Instead of relying upon American help, Fidel Castro got help from the Soviet Union. He set up a communist society instead of a democratic one. So all American businesses, American property owners, all of that now, instead of being owned by them, was owned by the government. All farms, all factories, all businesses in Cuba now, instead of owned by the people, were owned by the government. Cubans no longer had the right to protest against the government. freedom of speech was out the window. Cuban newspapers, radio stations, TV stations, all of them were shut down unless they were owned and operated by the government. Churches too. Cuba was a long-standing Catholic Christian country, but now Christianity and churches throughout Cuba could only operate if they got permission and were supervised by, you guessed it, the government. So how does America react to all of this? Not well. America is horrified that Cuba has turned into a communist state, not just a communist country, but one that is 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This is like the USSR having a best buddy right next door to America. Not only that, you had a bunch of people killed off by Fidel Castro and his new oppressive government. Americans lost all their property and rights within Cuba, and so America decides to do something about it, something drastic. Now, when Fidel Castro took control of Cuba, a lot of Cubans left. Some of them who did not die trying to fight against Fidel Castro and his new communist government, they escaped to Florida. And for a while there, America was welcoming a whole lot of Cubans who really wanted to get away from Castro and the communist government. The CIA had an idea, which they brought up before the new American president. In 1960, he was elected. His name is John F. Kennedy. You probably heard of him before. 1960, he approved of the plan the CIA had, the Central Intelligence Agency had, to take all these Cuban young men who really were passionate about taking back their country from Fidel Castro's communist grip and returning it back to the people. So the CIA trained these young men who were soldier age, in their 20s or so, learning how to be secret operatives, how to invade Cuba back and to take it back from Fidel Castro. This invasion would come to be known as the Bay of Pigs. The idea was simple. You take all of these secret operatives, you land them on the shores, you get the people to rally behind them, and then they lead a new revolution against Fidel Castro, just like he led against Fulgencio Batista, the last dictator. Well, that plan fell apart from the start. This is where the Bay of Pigs is seen. The Bahia de Cochinos. It was an unmitigated disaster. From the start, the first wave of American planes failed to destroy Cuba's airfields. Second, our ships carrying the Cuban CIA-trained revolutionaries had trouble landing at the Bay of Pigs because of coral reefs. Third, incredibly stupidly, the New York Times published a full-page story of the planned attack on Cuba a day or two before the invasion. So Castro now knew of the plan. Lastly, as soon as Kennedy understood that the media reported that America was helping this attack on Cuba, he stopped the second wave of planes from attacking Cuba. At that point, the operation was doomed. And so it's not a surprise when, in 1961, when these poor Cuban agents arrived, they were ambushed and immediately killed or taken prisoner by the Cuban government. This failed, botched Bay of Pigs invasion was a stain on President Kennedy's newly started presidential term. But the fun didn't stop there, because Fidel Castro being in charge was a problem for America, and Fidel Castro knew it. So it wouldn't be a surprise to say that he was rather paranoid about American plots. They were real, and they were many. America planned at least 8 assassination attempts on his life, including putting poison pills into Castro's drink, or poisoning food at the restaurant Castro most frequented, or filling his scuba suit with a rare bacteria, or hiding a hypodermic syringe inside of a pen. Some of them were rather comedic. Yet at the time that the CIA had tried to convince one of Fidel Castro's main girlfriends to murder him, failed. Or the time the CIA tried to plant an explosive in Fidel Castro's cigar, failed. Why were we trying to kill him off so much? Because Cuba was so close to America. And this is only going to confirm America's fears. In 1962, in October, a spy plane from America flies over the Cuban island and takes pictures of what is below. And what they see, what America sees, horrifies them. It's a missile launch site. And the only kind of missiles that are going to be launched are the nuclear variety. In fact, even as they're taking pictures, a fleet of Soviet ships with nuclear missiles on board is making their way to Cuba to give Fidel Castro enough nuclear missiles to be able to launch from their missile pads to reach any part of the American Southeast. Even the shortest range missiles could get as far as Georgia or Louisiana. The medium ones, well past Raleigh all the way to Washington, D.C., and the intercontinental ballistic missiles could reach as far as California from the launch site of Cuba. Under no circumstance will American President John F. Kennedy allow for these nuclear missiles to reach Cuba. So here begins the Cuban Missile Crisis. President John F. Kennedy gets on the phone with all these Latin American leaders, asking for all of their ships to form what's called a blockade around the island of Cuba. All of these ships with specific requests: do not let this Soviet fleet of ships cross this blockade and drop off these nuclear missiles to Fidel Castro. America issues the warning: if you try to get through this blockade, we will be forced to open fire on you. The Soviet premier, the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, he warns back: if we are not allowed to pass through into this territory to Cuba, we will open fire on you. America says we will not stop from using nuclear capabilities if you fire upon us. And the Soviet Union says, and we will use all nuclear power within our grasp to be able to fire upon you. And the ships come closer to the blockade, and the blockade does not let up. And in 1961, this really tense moment comes to a head. Are the Soviet ships going to turn around? Are the Americans going to open fire on the Soviet Union? Is nuclear war going to happen? All these fears are now culminating in this one climactic scene right outside Cuba. And at the last moment, President Kennedy and Khrushchev open up a line, like a direct contact between two leaders, and the Soviet Union makes it clear they are willing to turn their ships around only if America gives up all of the nuclear weapons that we have in Turkey, which is a neighboring country to the Soviet Union. American President JFK agrees, and the Soviet ships stop and they turn around. And it looks like an American victory, but really what it was a victory for humanity and a behind the closed doors negotiation to pull nuclear weapons away from the boundaries of both countries. Whew. That was a close call. After that, a hotline exists between the American president and the Soviet Union, always with the chance of stopping nuclear war from happening. That's the closest it's ever come that we know of. Also, a limited test ban treaty was also in the works, just to make sure that nuclear weapons didn't get so out of control. What happens to Cuba in the years after that? Fidel Castro goes on to continue his human rights violations in his oppressive government. Churches are shut down, people lose their rights. The economy suffers big time. And because Cuba remains communist, America puts on an embargo. And an embargo is a law prohibiting people from your country from buying goods from another country. So America's embargo on Cuba means that no Americans can legally buy anything from Cuba, including cigars that some people really like, which really hurts Cuba's economy. Here's President Kennedy signing the embargo in 1962. Things haven't improved much between America and Cuba in the years since then. We still have an embargo in place. America still retains rights of one small part of Cuba called Guantanamo Bay, which has been a controversial point where there have been a lot of confirmed accusations of torture that have gone on of military prisoners. But America has had this base for over 120 years now and is not likely to give it up anytime soon. And still to this day, people from Cuba come however they can, getting away from the oppressive communist regime to America's shores. Sometimes they make it in jury-rigged boats, and sometimes when the waters are choppy, they don't live through the attempt. But things are still desperate enough in Cuba where people try to get away every year to make it to a land that is freer. Fidel Castro did eventually give up his rule in 2008 after almost 50 years of being in power. He handed off his control to his younger brother, Raul. I say younger sarcastically because they're almost the same age, as this political cartoon makes fun. Cuba remains a communist country even now, and is impoverished, and does still commit many human rights violations against its own people. As you are probably aware, John F. Kennedy died 1 year after the embargo, 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, assassinated in Dallas, Texas. He was only president for 3 years. He was the last president in American history to be assassinated. There's the good and the bad about John F. Kennedy. He is oftentimes romanticized and glorified as a figure who died too soon, was young, and much of that is based on fact. But there are good and bad sides to every man, and John F. Kennedy was no exception. He was a war hero who saved the lives of many people on his Navy boat during World War II, and he did sign into law a civil rights bill to make laws fair to Black Americans. He called the wife of Martin Luther King Jr. when he was inside of a prison. But on the other side, John F. Kennedy was known for his inexcusable affairs, the many adulteries that he carried on while being married to his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. And he did start up the Vietnam conflict by sending the first advisors to Vietnam that his successor, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, continued. A 10-year war that didn't end well. But John F. Kennedy was probably best known for promising that we would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. And on that, he was right. He didn't get to live to see it, but America did eventually win the space race that John F. Kennedy played a major role in. And now we get to our third topic. That's right, nuclear annihilation. Maybe you've seen Fallout Boy before. Let's say you're that American student in 1960. You're probably worried about all of civilization coming to an end as you know it through some horrific nuclear attack that is carried out by both America and the USSR that eventually leads to the whole planet becoming one sterile rock of radioactivity floating in space with no humans on it alive anymore. This was a real fear back in 1950 and 1960 and 1970, and American school children were trained by Bert the Turtle and other documentaries to duck and cover. In case your city is bombed, it's best to get under a desk. I mean, I guess it's better than nothing. At least it makes you feel like you're safer having some kind of plan. Kind of like wearing cloth masks when an epidemic is all around. Huh? What? No. Anyway, moving on. This fear of nuclear attack was so prevalent. I can't say enough how much a part of American way of life this became. And it wasn't just us. Around the world, people were really fascinated and horrified and afraid of what this new age, this atomic age, this prospect of nuclear war could bring in. And sure, if the Cold War were fought with unicorns, it'd look something like this. But it wasn't. It was fought more with proxy wars, a space race, and with the threat of nuclear weapons. And so it looked more like classrooms trained to react in the case of an atomic bomb being dropped near your city, and bomb shelters built in your basement or somewhere in your community, or movies that portrayed what happened when the world was destroyed in an apocalyptic vision of the future when humanity was all but wiped out. I mean, we all love dystopian movies. We see them now all the time in Hunger Games and Divergent, The Giver, and the Maze Runner series. But dystopias and dark futures really got their big start in the Cold War. Movies like Dr. Strangelove or On the Beach, about the likely impending doom of a world gone mad that destroys itself in a nuclear war. Or movies like The Thing That Came from Another World, The Day of the Triffids, or The Day the Earth Stood Still, are all about alien life that arrives on our planet with a threat of wiping out all life as we know it. The Cold War fears of a nuclear holocaust also kick-started the current craze of zombie movies, such as films like The Last Man on Earth or Night of the Living Dead, in which it was envisioned a world in which humanity was all but lost and quickly turning into flesh-eating undead. And many other apocalyptic movies. The Time Machine, based on the H.G. Wells book, and Planet of the Apes were both set in the far future when visitors come to a foreign landscape where humans have become hunted slaves for their animal masters. I mean, that's a rough summation. I don't want to give away any spoilers. And speaking of films with twist endings, movies like Soylent Green featured a dystopian Earth with humans having to devise desperate means to feed its starving populace. And the list goes on. The Andromeda Strain, where humanity could well be wiped out by a virus that comes from space. The Mad Max movie series, in which the world is an Australian wasteland after a nuclear war. So much so it makes New York rush hour look tame in comparison. You get the idea. There were movies, ranging from them to Godzilla, about what happens, what kind of new monsters could develop now that they were exposed to this new unleashed nuclear power that brought kaiju up from the ocean's depths or transformed basic insects into man-eating creatures. And not just scary movies. In 1962, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby started to make superheroes come to life on the page, all of them built inside of this framework of a new nuclear threat. How did Bruce Banner get his Incredible Hulk powers? Oh, from a nuclear bomb going off, and the gamma radiation entered into his body, turning him into a green Goliath. Never mind the fact that none of that actually works out with science. Or what about a new group of teenagers taught by a bald-headed telepath who take up their home inside of a mansion, all with crazy new powers called mutants, being able to turn into ice or shoot concussive beams out of your eyes. Oh, and what were they called, these X-Men? Children of the Atom. Splitting the atom, atomic age. I mean, this was everywhere. And you can hear it in songs too. People fixated on this fear, not knowing what was going to come next. Couldn't we all just avoid war, specifically nuclear war? That was the question. Bob Dylan, Peter, Paul and Mary, the Beatles, all of them sang songs in the hope that we could avoid this kind of mutually assured destruction. I mean, that is the phrase we use to describe if you have nuclear weapons and I have nuclear weapons and we both send them against each other, we're both going to be destroyed, but we're going to mutually assure each other's destruction. In fact, at one point, by the 1970s, America and the Soviet Union had so many nuclear weapons that you could literally kill off all life on planet Earth twice. I mean, we had a huge stockpile. It's what we call the arms race. Got a little out of hand. So eventually by 1972, President Richard Nixon met with the Soviet premier and agreed in what we call SALT treaties to scale back the number of nuclear weapons we were keeping inside of nuclear submarines and nuclear warhead silos, and we did get rid of most of our weapons. So you've listened to me share about espionage, about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and about the fears of nuclear war. And now that you've heard all of that, you get a chance to complete the questions on the Cuban Missile Crisis that are there for you in Google Classroom. There's some cool reading details into what we just described for you to get more of a background. And then just answer the questions and send that back to me by Google Classroom. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. And now, I think I'll have that drink.